So React 19 is finally here and now out in beta. And that means we're actually one step closer to the final release. And it actually comes with a brand new features like hooks, actions in here, as we all know before, server components and server actions, and stuff like better errors, better context in here, refs, so many awesome updates that literally gonna change how we work with React. So yes, it's very important for you to learn about these new features sooner rather than later. So first, we got brand new hooks in React, and one of them is the useTransition. And this hook will help you keep track of different transitions that happen across your components. And if you look closely into documentation, the useTransition in here is defined as a useTransition is React hook that lets you update state without blocking the UI. I mean, that may seem a little bit kind of complicated, but in simpler terms, all it does, it allows you to start a transition, and it knows and tells you about the status of the transition. And the transition in here could be any asynchronous function. So here's a very simple example. Now, imagine in here, we've got this function in here that all it does, just like an asynchronous function, and it's gonna take a name and allow us to actually update the name on the database or somewhere. So we're just using simple wait in here, and just like waiting for 4 seconds just for demo purposes. And here we've got 3 states, one to keep track of the name, the other one to keep track of errors, and the last one in here is actually we're using the useTransition. And as clear as in here, the useTransition every single time it returns, the first one is going to be a boolean, and it's going to tell you whether this current transition that you're going to start, is it pending or not, so true or false. And this is the function that takes an asynchronous function that allows you to start the transition. So this is basically how we're using it here. So whenever we click on handle submit, or the user clicks on handle submit for submitting a new name, we're simply just doing start transition in here, and it's clear in here we're passing an async function. That simple async function in there will execute literally any asynchronous code, like await update name in here, and it checks, for example, oh, if there's any errors or whatever. And in the meantime, while this is running, of course, because it's going to take 4 seconds, so while this transition is actually running, this is pending variable is going to become true, which means it's actually pending. And once it's done, it's going to become false. It's not pending anymore. So you can imagine this as is loading instead of is pending. I don't know why React team decided to go with is pending example in here, because most of us React developers are familiar with the is loading kind of variable. That's basically the same thing. So you can simply replace this is pending with is loading, just to make it easier to understand. And of course, later on in here, for the handle submit, you can basically just put it on the bottom where you click on that one, and this is gonna start the transition. And this useTransition here is gonna just save you from just go ahead and doing like is loading states and keeping track of that and doing like, oh, set is loading true and set like it's like this. And for example, when your async call is done, you just go ahead and do set is loading to false back again. It's just like pain. So instead, use one single thing and you start transition and let it handle the rest for you. So in our example in here, this is actually how it works. Let's say I'm going to update my name in here. I'm going to just put something in here. It's clear to see pending is false. And once I click update on this one, I'm going to get like pending true. And for 4 seconds, it's going to keep pending. Then pending is going to switch up to false because the transition is simply finished. The second very interesting hook is the useAction state, which kind of like encapsulates the useTransition hook and give you one single API to work with. So you can imagine our previous example in here for updating a name using an input, and that's basically the commented out code that uses the useTransition. So instead of that, I did comment that code, and instead I replaced all of this, like the state, the errors in here, handling the pending, and just doing all of that with this single sort of like line of code or block of code in here. All it does is just simply use the useAction state and actually takes everything that it needs. So of course, it takes an asynchronous function that's going to run on the action. It's going to return for you error, or basically whatever objects or anything you return is going to be returned as the first one. For the second one here is going to be the actual action, which is going to be just a function that you can pass to a form in here inside of the action prop in here. I'm going to talk about the action prop in a bit. And last but not least, you're going to get either it's pending or not. So like the same thing as a transition, because that's basically using a transition behind the scenes. So it's going to tell you whether this action is still pending or is it finished. And of course, make sure to pass in the submit action right into the action in here inside of the form for it to work perfectly. And the form in here is going to take it from here. Just, you're going to call the action in here. It's going to pass in the form data in here automatically. And the useStateAction is going to pass in the previous state. So you can use it however you want. So now if we try this example, we can do update, I get updating as well. So I get is pending in here. The button is being updated in here, and everything is working fine. And all of that is just with a single hook in here that literally does everything for you and encapsulates a lot of stuff. So instead of just doing all of this by yourself and creating so many states and keeping track of them, you just use one hook in here to rule them all, and that's actually going to help you a lot, especially in forms, because as we all know, most of the times as developers or front-end developers in here, we're always going to be dealing with forms one way or another. So that means using it this way and having this hook in here, the useActionState hook, is going to help us a lot achieve what we want in fewer lines of code and faster and way much easier. So I'm literally in love with this new hook in here, and I believe so many people will agree with me as well. Of course, the useActionState in here should be imported from the React library. And for those who are wondering where is the form data, it's actually through the HTML form API. And the form data is just basically an object that represents the current form in here that the action is attached to, and this will allow you to access all the properties or basically all the inputs that is inside of the form itself with the name property. So it's clear in here, with this input in here has the name property that is equal to name. So all I'm do get name, and that's what's gonna return to me the value of this input. So no need to keep track of like the value of the input in here on a new state, like set name and do the onChange kind of like event handler and all of those creepy stuff. You just do one simple thing is gonna help you manage everything in one place. And the third hook in here is the useFormStatus hook that simply just allows you to access the form status inside of a child component. And of course, those child components should be inside of a form. So for example, we got this design button in here, which should be rendered inside of a form. So using this hook, useFormStatus, you can literally access the parent form's status in here without any issues. So for example, you can get isPending, you can even get like the action and a bunch of other properties. So you can imagine it something like this, where for example, you got your useActionState in here and you're handling everything like the asynchronous code in here for submitting. And let's say we've got a normal form in here. So the form has an input, it has a component button, which means a normal HTML button that is encapsulated inside of another wrapper component and a bunch of other JSX elements. Now, usually when we want to pass in something to the button like the isPending or anything, we have to pass it as a prop. For example, this is actually our button, how we would do it the old way. So form button old in here, we pass in isPending as a prop in here and we can use it. But with the new hook in here, it's going to save us this. We don't need to pass that one in. It's going to basically use context behind the scenes for you. React is going to handle everything behind the scenes for you. And all you got to do is just basically use this new useFormStatus, and it's going to get you isPending, and you can use isPending in here however you like. For some reason, I wasn't able to get this one working. I don't know why. Maybe there's an issue with it. Maybe it's still in beta. So hopefully they will fix it soon or something. But I believe in the final release, this will be working fine. And of course, this useFormStatus in here should be imported from the React DOM, but not the React core. Alright, so the last interesting hook of the day is the useOptimistic. So I've already covered this in a completely separate video with all the details. I'm not going to go into all the details because I'm going to find video on my channel or down in the description below. You can just get all the details about useOptimistic. But for this one, I'm just going to give you a quick overview and a quick example to simply understand how useOptimistic actually works. So to better understand useOptimistic, I just created this simple user chat component in here where people can, of course, chat like a normal WhatsApp or something, where they can send messages and receive messages. And what we want is actually whenever we click on send a message in here, how it usually works in big applications like that, you gotta take that message, send it to the server, and allow the server to do all the combination to send it to the other party, save it on the database. That's probably gonna take some time, and get back to us, oh, message sends, so we can show it to the user. But we don't want to actually wait all of that to show the message to the user. We want to immediately, once the user clicks on the send button in here, we want to just immediately show that message, then actually work on sending the message behind the scenes, so our application would feel a little bit more interactive. So for example, click send in here, excuse in here, get this send in, and get this empty kind of circle that is telling, oh, send in or sent, and it's going to be filled out once the message is fully sent in the background. So using the help of useOptimistic, I was able to implement this in a very, very simple way. So here's actually our component. So simply here we've got state to keep track of messages and set messages. And here we're actually using useOptimistic. So of course, useOptimistic in here is going to return two things. It's not like a normal use state. So it's going to return the state itself and a function in here that allows you to update the state. So it takes like the first parameter in here, like the initial values, And the second one in here is like a function that tells it how to add whatever data that gets added or called with this function into the state itself. So for example, in here at optimistic message, I want to add a new message to our array. So simply I'm just doing like states and a new message in here. And of course, there's actually the current state. So I can just go ahead and prepend that and make sure I add a new object for like, the new message, whether it's sending or not, and from what, like all the details about that current message. Now, inside of my form action in here, all I do is just get forms data in here. I go ahead and first do add optimistic message so we can early show that message to the user. You can simply go ahead and reset the form in here and later on send the message to the server. Now simply we can just, when we render that one, the GSX part, we can do optimistic messages map, so map through all the optimistic messages in here and go ahead and send or basically render all of them. And here I'm just checking, whether it's sending, I just showed me that as an empty circle, or if it's sent already, just show that as sent. Now, literally, that's all I'm doing in here. I'm just using the optimistic messages. And you're probably wondering, how am I like merging the optimistic messages with this messages sort of array? Well, I'm not. That's why it's like optimistic. And this kind of like hook is very, very amazing. So behind the scenes in here, when the new messages in here are changed, the useOptimistic is going to react, it's going to like merge this new messages with your old optimistic messages. And it's just going to like create the perfect state for you so you don't have to worry about like keeping them in sync. That's basically the magic of useOptimistic. And this way we can create something like this where you can send and you get this really nice interactive behavior. Well, the next big thing in React 19 is a completely brand new API in here that I know a lot of people were excited about. We already tested that in Next.js, but now it's time to use this inside of React and it's going to be absolutely mind-blowing. The new use method in here, you can call it a method sort of API. It's not a hook. So don't call use hook in here. It's completely not a hook, but I can call it like a use method in here. So it's actually kind of magical because this one's going to allow you to use promises and async await. And you basically wait for the promise to finish in here in order to render the UI, which is pretty magical and is going to be mind-blowing and twisting as well. All right, so got a simple example in here that all it does goes actually tries to fetch comments and it fetches the users afterward. So here, if I go ahead and refresh, as curious in here, you see, loading comments, and in the comments in here, you see, comments promise done first, then it's just going to say users promise done second. So it tries to fetch both of them using the use method. So this is actually our component. Simply, first function in here is actually to get the users, just like an asynchronous function that waits 5 seconds in here and returns an array of, a bunch of static users in here. We got the comments as well. It waits 2 seconds in here and returns all the comments and returns, is fetch users true or not, to whether tell it to fetch the users or not. Now, in our component in here, we're simply just taking the two promises. I'm going to talk about why we're taking the two promises in a second. And here, the use in here takes a promise, and it doesn't take a function. You cannot call the promise in here like this. It doesn't take the function reference in here like the get comments or anything. You have to pass in an already fired promise in here in order for this to work. And here we're just simply waiting for the comments and is fetch users. So first we just render up or console log the comments in here. Then we go ahead and do users. And the mind twisting part, if you are familiar with like why I did say this is not a hook, because you can call this conditionally and hooks cannot be called conditionally. So here I'm checking, is fetch users true? If it is, I will go ahead and use the use in here to fetch the users from the user's promise. It's kind of magical, right? So this will, depending on this kind of variable, it's going to like fetch me the users or not. And later on, I'm just going to go ahead and render it as I normally would. So why did I say you have to receive the promise in here through the props and you cannot do something like get comments, for example, in here to call it? Because as we know, the get comments in here returns a promise, right? It should. So doing it this way should be fine. But if you try to do it this way and you go back to the console in here, React's going to fire you. It's going to just give you a warning here, say, a component was suspended by an encached promise. Creating a promise inside a client component or hook is not yet supported, except via suspense compatible library or framework, and they're probably talking about Next.js in this case. So it's not yet supported. They're going to actually provide other APIs to cache promises inside of components or hooks in the future, but for now, it is not supported whatsoever. So that's why you cannot create this function. You cannot create the promise in here. By calling this function, we're creating the promise inside of the component itself, so we cannot do this one. What we have to do is actually create it somewhere else, and here I'm actually creating it inside of the parent component, which is the comments page, where I'm doing the suspense in here, and right before when I call the comments in here, I'm just passing the get users and get comments in here. Of course, I'm actually calling those to return the actual promise. Now, what you've already noticed in here is actually the suspense. So you have to use the suspense in here of any components or child components, or let me rephrase. So you have to wrap any child component that uses the use API within a suspense. Otherwise, React will be very mad. Because the suspense in here is going to actually display a UI or a fallback UI that is going to be used for load-in before the actual promise is resolved. And that's exactly what we get when we get like this loading comments. It's basically coming from right over here. The other cool stuff that actually React introduced in React 19 is React Server Components. I know that you've probably already heard a lot about server components, you use them in Next.js, but this time React is not implementing server components because it can't do that technically. It has to rely on a framework like Next.js to do that for it. But what React's actually providing is actually server components sort of functions and APIs that are working behind the scenes and can be used by those frameworks or other libraries to implement those server components and SSR rendering and all of that kind of stuff. So now kind of like React is standardizing the server component architecture and providing its own APIs for frameworks to use them. So that will make it a little bit more stable. People can actually rely on this. You can have one single API to use in all of them. So like one source of truth and so many cool benefits. And basically the same thing goes for server actions because, both of them needs to be run on the server in here. So you can't technically run those inside of React itself, but you have to use a framework like Next.js with server components in here, which I think is a pretty bold move and it's going to help a lot in standardizing server components in the future. All right, so now we come to small teeny tiny improvements in React 19. So the ref prop in here, you no longer need to use the forward ref. Like as we all know, familiar with forward ref, to passing a ref to a component, you have to use the forward ref function in here in order to be able to pass that ref, rename the ref technically. But now with React 19, you literally just passing the ref as in any other prop in here without any issues, and you can use it as a regular ref. So this is simply the old implementation versus the new implementation. The old one, we have to do React forward ref in here to actually grab the props and the ref, and you can later on passing the ref in here normally. But this time for defining a new component, you don't need to do that. Refs can be passed through in here as normal props in here. It can be used as a normal props as well with no issues, and you just pass them as any other normal prop. Next on the line is form actions, and next on the line is form actions, and you've probably already seen that in different hooks and stuff, but it's actually very simple. All you can do in here now using forms, you can actually pass in the action prop. And that action prop can be a normal asynchronous function, and the form is going to run this action prop when the form is being submitted. So for example, we've got a button here with a type submit, and you click enter or you click that button, the form is going to be submitted, and it's actually going to call this form action here, which is a submit action, which means it's going to call this, asynchronous function over here. And the most important part is going to pass you the form data in here as a first parameter, not an event, nothing like that, just the form data in here, and you can access the whole form inputs and different elements in here with this API like get name or whatever by just defining this one. I'm absolutely in love with this one, and I know this API is going to help us a lot as developers. And yes, no more foggy code and different implementations. We can finally all agree on implementing forms in one way without those so many other libraries and just use it this very simple way. Now, when it comes to context, yes, React 19 came with a new thing, and you don't no longer need to do context.provider like theme.provider or something. You just say you've got this context, you just call the context as it is. So the old way, this is actually basically how we did it. You create a context or whatever, and whenever you're calling the context and you want to actually provide the context, you have to do the context name in here, and you do .provider, and you can pass in the children. Now, you don't need to do that anymore because all you just simply do is just pass in the theme context in here or whatever context without the .provider, and that should just work fine. I'm not sure exactly why this changed. I tried to look why. Maybe if you know, let me know in the comments below. But it's a cool change that you didn't have to do the .provider or something, but it doesn't look very significant to context anyway. And for refs, you can actually have cleanup functions when you actually define your refs. So this function here is going to be called whenever the ref in here is going to be unmounted or simply removed from the DOM, which is pretty good and memory friendly as well. And finally, there is actually a new change in React 19 that actually going to make errors look less uglier and a little bit better. So instead of having tons of thousands of errors in here in your console log, now React is just going to try to give you a simple one error log in here that just makes a little bit more sense. And yes, React 19 now natively support for document metadata. The document metadata means like when you are inside of your component, let's say a blog post in here, like a very deep nested child component, and you want to actually change the title of the web page, how you do that, before you have to use a library like React Helmet or something like a third-party library. But now React allows you just to include the title in here, meta, link, any kind of like document metadata tag right into the component child component itself. It's going to hoist it by itself, and it's going to actually apply all of that to the DOM by itself, which is pretty interesting. So it's actually a before and after comparison. So before, you have to use like a library, the React Helmet in here, which you simply just do helmet in here, and you can just do, you know, the document metadata tags in here, and the library itself is going to take care of like synchronizing this with the head inside of your documents or HTML documents. But now React is going to take care of that, which is going to be making it a little bit more reliable. And I think third-party libraries are going to benefit from this quite a lot. And now the support for custom element in React 19 is finally there, and all of the tests, like literally all the tests in here, are passing. So there's actually this website, Custom Elements Everywhere, which basically takes every single framework or library and tests the support of that library against different tests to see if it actually supports custom elements or not. So React, before with React 8.2.0, it has a 67% score. Like it literally passed no advanced tests, whatever. But for literally all the others in here, I think for the experimental one is actually passing all of them. There's actually the experimental library that means, I think it is, I'm not sure about that because it says July 2022, but for other stuff like Vue, Angular in here, Svelte, AngularJS, Preact, all of them literally supports custom elements. And if you're not familiar with custom elements, there's actually this really awesome guide from the web dev in here from Google that simply explains how it works and everything. And simply what this one basically does, it allows you to actually extend the actual HTML elements kind of like library. So instead of having only a div, a span, a p tag, you can create your own custom tags, and you can just make those tags operate and behave however you like, which is pretty interesting. And now you can do it inside of React as well. So anyway guys, thank you for watching. This has been React 19 beta. I tried to go through all the features in here. So because now it's beta, probably most of these features are not going to change it. All they're going to make it to the stable release, but we'll see how it goes. So if you have any questions or concerns, let me know down below in the comments, and I'll be very happy to have a discussion. So thank you guys for watching. See you hopefully in the next ones.